Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bill Wiebel. I am the Executive Secretary for the show at the moment. And this evening, we would like to welcome Ron Peterson for this important lecture. Ron Peterson is the chair of the Orleans Historical Commission, where he has served for 7 years. He also served on the Orleans Community Preservation Committee, as co-chair on the Orleans Historical Markers Committee, and chair of the Attack on Orleans, commemorating the 1918 U-boat assault on Orleans. Ron was a presenter at the Cape Wide The Mayflower Stopped Here First Symposium, and he writes a monthly column in the Cape Codder newspaper on regional history and historic preservation. He has lectured throughout Cape Cod on local historical topics. We welcome Ron to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to Cho for having me here tonight. It's really a pleasure. And what's a real pleasure about this is the first time in 15 months that I've done a live lecture. And if I never have to do another Zoom lecture in my life, that's soon enough for me. It's just not the same. COVID certainly has put a damper on a lot of our lives over the past year. Most importantly to the people who lost their lives or lost their health, but it also had a significant impact on our social lives, our economic lives, our educational lives, and that's in ways that I'm sure we don't understand yet. But I'm glad now we're able to start to recover. And one of the casualties, I think, of the COVID pandemic was the Plymouth 400 commemoration. As we remember, 2020 was going to be the year that we remembered the 1620 landing of the Mayflower and the colonization, the Plymouth Colony, the establishment of Plymouth Colony. And many historians and many people consider that to be part of the founding story of our country. And we weren't able to do that. I don't want to minimize a lot of the efforts that were done. There were a number of remote events that occurred and lectures, and I was privileged and honored to be a part of some of those. But it's just not the same. We really lost a lot of that opportunity, and I'm hoping that we can carry that forward in 1621. And that's really why we're here tonight and why we're doing this lecture tonight, because the Plymouth 400 story is an important one. It's full of myths, it's full of truth, and it's really time that society in general took a look at that story and separated the myths from the realities and balanced the historical ledger, so to speak. The Mayflower story is one that's come down to us over the years as this, I like to call it a hazy, glowing legend. It's one that can easily be acted out in children's pageants. There's a number of 18th and 19th century paintings that depict some of the events in ways that they didn't happen. But when we look at the Mayflower story, as I learned it as a kid and growing up, and as most of us did, some of it's true. Some of it's true as far as it goes. Some of it is historically inaccurate and has no historical basis for it. Some of it's flat out false. And most importantly, a significant part of it is just left out. And a part of that is the role of the Native Americans, the people that were here for 10,000 years, archaeologists tell us, before the Mayflower landed. the Native Americans are, they kind of appear in the legend when they're needed, then they disappear back into the forest when they're not. And we just have never, well, up until around 1970, there was never a real effort to take a look at how the Mayflower story and the colonization of America impacted the people who were already here. You know, the European colonists didn't discover America, it had already been discovered. You know, but you know, they do appear, you know, they appear when they're needed, and they disappear when you know, when they're not, and the emphasis is on other things. You saw the title of the presentation, its influences on the Wampanoag perspective from 1602 to 1630. I don't mean to stand here and tell you what the Wampanoag perspective was. I can't do that. I'm not a Wampanoag descendant. I don't claim to be. I don't, to the best of my knowledge, I have no Native American blood at all in my heritage, nor do I have any Mayflower descendants' blood. If I have a relationship to the story, I'm more likely descended from the Vikings, who may or may not have been here in the year 1000, and not anybody in the immediate story. But the hazy legend that I mentioned is a one-sided story. It implies more than it relates, and it omits more than it includes. So we're looking to balance the historical ledger a little bit tonight, and look at the events that occurred prior to the Mayflower landing, and to think about how they might have influenced the Native Americans that were already here, and how those events played a role in the events that actually did happen. The whole story may have begun around the year 1000, and it still continues today, but that's way too much for a one-hour lecture. We're going to focus on 1602 to 1630. 1602 is the year I selected because that's the year we first start to get some meat on the bones and some understanding of what the early contacts between European colonists and Native Americans were like. And I focused entirely on the immediate area around Massachusetts. These contacts have been occurring for many years before 1602, all up and down the American coast. But we're looking to narrow this down and to keep the scope of the presentation reasonable. Okay. Just to give you a teaser, I'm coming back later in this lecture series to talk more about some of the specific myths, but a lot of what we hear and what we know about, or think we know about the Mayflower story just isn't true. And these are a couple of examples. Plymouth Rock. There's no historical evidence that there was ever a rock that was significant in the Plymouth landing. That story, there was never a mention of a rock until 171 years later. And that story was third hand. And the logistics and the events that happened just don't support that story at all. But yet, that's an example. The painting on the left is an example of how we perceive the Pilgrim Landing. There just is no historical basis for that. And the first Thanksgiving is another one that is largely myth. But I won't spoil the. I think that's in November, Jay. Yeah. I won't spoil that one. You'll need to come back to hear about those and others. One of the challenges that historians face in trying to put this story together is that the sources are fairly thin and they're one-sided. The Native Americans did not have a written language. That's just a fact. It would be great if we could read Massasoit's journal alongside of Bradford's and draw an objective opinion, but we can't. It's just a fact. It didn't happen. And there's an old saying in the field of history that history gets to be written by the winners. So you're seeing a kind of a one-sided view. Although I have to say, after reading many of the original texts that have survived and that we have available in some of the early histories, I think they were, given that, I think some of them were remarkably objective. Many of the facts and the circumstances that refute some of the myths are actually hidden in plain sight in some of the works by William Bradford and Edward Winslow. You see photographs, the slide, the photo on the left is what William Bradford might have looked like. Nobody knew. He never, to the best of anybody's knowledge, ever sat for a portrait, but that's a statue that they've erected of him in Plymouth. The gentleman on the right is Edward Winslow. That is what he looked like. He's one of the only, if not the only, Mayflower passengers that ever sat for a portrait. This was later in his life. He had gone back to England, and so that's an actual portrait of him. William Bradford, of course, wrote of Plymouth Plantation, which was a journal that he wrote between 1630 and 1651, and it covers the year 1608 to 1647. It's a remarkable piece of literature. It's a tough read the first time you try to read it, but it's worth sticking with. It really is remarkable. Winslow is attributed with writing a book called Mort's Relation, which was a very short pamphlet type book that went back to England on the fortune. I think it was in late 1621. And that was the history of the early years, which depicted some of the critical events, and a lot of what I talk about tonight is mentioned in Mort. And he also wrote Good News from New England, which was a similar document that covered the years 1622 and 1623. And they were both published in England in the hopes of attracting more colonists to come over to this country, to this land. Obviously, it wasn't a country at the time. Winslow was, in effect, the first travel journalist in the New World. He was really a remarkable figure, and a lot of what we know today we're indebted to him for. In the early contact period, the period before 1620, we're indebted to the individuals who were on some of the ships, the exploratory ships that came over here from European countries. They wrote their accounts of their encounters with the Native Americans, and but again, they're much more limited, and in a sense, they're also one-sided. And many of the early histories, the second generation of histories after Bradford and Winslow, were written by people who participated, second-generation participants. Nathaniel Morton wrote the first published history of Plymouth Colony. It was published in 1668, and it relied largely on Bradford's work. Morton was actually a nephew of Bradford's and lived in his household for his formative years. Thomas Prince wrote one of the early histories of the colony, but he was a Puritan minister. So his account was written from that perspective. William Hubbard and the very famous Cotton Mather were others who wrote early histories, but they were Puritan ministers as well and wrote it from that perspective. They believed that the colonization by the Puritans and the separatists were God's will, and that this was all predetermined. So that gives you an idea early on of how the story, the Mayflower story, and some of the myths around it and legends came about. This is just a quick picture of the lay of the land when the Mayflower landed. You'll see that the Wampanoag tribe was the closest tribe. They at one point had control of all of the land. This map doesn't show it, but an important tribe was the Nauset's, which existed right out where we are now at the elbow of the Cape. But this was the other tribe, the Massachusetts, the Nipmuc, the Narragansett, the Mohicans, and the Pequots all played a role in the story that ensued. The Wampanoag Nation wasn't a single tribe. It was a confederation of tribes. And as I studied, I was extremely impressed the more I read about the Wampanoags, of the advanced system of governance that they had. Their great leader, Massasoit, was the head of the Wampanoag Confederation, but he didn't rule by fiat. They had in a sense, it was a democracy. Any of the subordinate tribes, the Nauset's or the Mashpees or any of the others, the Patuxets, were free to leave the Confederation at any time. So being a sachem, especially the grand sachem that Massasoit was, required a lot of diplomacy and a lot of skill in the way that he governed or she governed. There were female sachems in those days. Massasoit's name, Massasoit was the Wampanoag name. What Massasoit means is great sachem. His name was actually Osamequin. You don't see that very often in history books, and for that reason I don't use that to identify him, but his name actually was Osamequin. I mentioned that 1602 was the first year we started to get some meat on the bones about the early contacts. The hazy legend at least implies that when the Mayflower had arrived, this was the first time that Europeans and local Native Americans ever laid eyes on one another. That just simply is not true. There was a long history, as we'll see, of contact, and very consequential contacts to the future of our history. But historians and archaeologists have suggested that there were many European visitors to New England prior to the 1600s. But hard evidence, as we began to see later, just isn't there. We know that, we think, there are some archaeologists that are convinced, others not so much, that the Vikings might have been here in the year 1000. It's probable that John and Sebastian Cabot at least took a look at Cape Cod during their 1498 voyage. In 1524, Giovanni Verrazzano visited Narragansett Bay, and this painting is of supposedly of Verrazano's ship. He spent some time there. He wrote a little bit about contact with the Native Americans, but the content is pretty sparse. But it appeared that the contacts that they had were peaceful. He probably made contact with two of the tribes that became significant in the Plymouth story, the Wampanoags, who were on the east side of Narragansett Bay, and the Narragansetts, who were on the west side. The reason he was there is that he was on a search at the time. The Europeans believed that there was a northwest passage that would lead them through the American continent to the Far East. Of course, that wasn't true, but they thought it was. And when he saw Narragansett Bay, he said, aha, there it is. But he later found that that wasn't true. The historian Nathaniel Philbrick has suggested that one of the native leaders that Verrazano met might have been Massasoit's great-grandfather. The first meat on the bone, so to speak, that we get is the voyage of Bartholomew Gosnold to New England. We all know Bartholomew Gosnold. I'm sure all the residents of Cape Cod know, and probably most of our visitors know, hey, that's the guy that gave Cape Cod its name. And that's true, he did. In 1602, he was anchored in Provincetown Harbor, probably very near where the Mayflower ended up anchoring. And they were so impressed with the amount of codfish that they were bringing on board that Gosnold named the area Cape Cod, something that stuck until today. But we're indebted to two people on his ship, Gabriel Archer and John Brereton. Archer was the master, or the captain, as we call him today, of the ship, the Concord, and Brereton was the chaplain. They sailed in 1602 with a crew of 32. On May 14th, they came off the coast of Maine, and they were approached by what they described as a Biscay shallop, just off of what's now Cape Nettic. At first, they thought it was a group of, as Archer put it, Christians in distress, but they turned out to be local natives, and the leader of this, the natives on this boat, was wearing English clothes. According to Archer, they came boldly aboard and spoke diverse Christian words, and they seemed to understand much better than we, which tells you that this wasn't the first time that they had contact with Europeans. That had gone back quite a while before that, and we find out later that of course is very true. It was apparently a very friendly encounter. We don't know any more than that about it, other than that after that encounter, the Concord headed south, went to Provincetown Harbor, anchored there where the name Cape Cod came about. Then they sailed further south to the area of Martha's Vineyard, which Gosnold also named, presumably in honor of his daughter, who was also named Martha. And he visited Buzzards Bay and the Elizabeth Islands. His intent was to establish a permanent or semi-permanent trading post. He was going to leave 20 of his 32-man crew on the island of Cuttyhunk, which is the island that became Cuttyhunk. But that didn't work out. What ensued once the crew landed, think about this. The first thing they did, first off, they were all heavily armed men, and the first thing they did was build a fort. So you have to wonder, somebody comes onto your property armed and builds a fort. That signal's not very inviting to a good relationship. But they did end up communicating, and they ended up trading, and they ended up having exchanging quite a bit of communication. But this became the pattern for many of the visits that followed. It was an ambiguous, hot and cold kind of a relationship. At one point, the English took a mashoon or a canoe from the Indians to use without asking. The natives took a target from the natives or from the English. The relationship went downhill. The English made angry threats after the target was taken. The natives complained of immodest touch of Wampanoag women. And one thing that was interesting is that the Wampanoags, and Brereton writes about this, were reluctant to go aboard the English ship, go aboard the Concord. And we're going to learn why in a little while, but the European visitors often had the bad habit of capturing natives and subduing them and taking them back to Europe and selling them into slavery or using them in ways to further colonization. But they already saw that tendency, that they were reluctant to go aboard the ship. So as early as 1602, they likely knew about that practice. At one point, 4 Wampanoags ambushed 2 Englishmen while they were shellfishing, wounding one. And after that, Gosnold abandoned his plans to establish a permanent mission and took off back to England. But that pattern, the hot and cold relationships, the sometimes good, sometimes bad, deteriorating into violence, is a pattern that we'll see again and again. The next year, Martin Pring sailed into what's now Palmet Harbor in Truro. I got the right slide there. He had a crew of 44 in 2 ships. They anchored in Palmet Harbor and spent about 2 months there in the future town of Truro. They planted some experimental gardens, and they harvested sassafras, which at the time in England they believed sassafras was a cure for venereal disease. Apparently was very much in demand at that time. But it was the familiar pattern existed here too. The first thing they did was build a fort. And they had ambiguous relationships with the natives, at times friendly, at times hostile. They would invite the natives to come into the fort, and the natives, one of the writers on the Pring voyage wrote that they were enchanted with one of the crew members who played a guitar. But when the English tired of their visitors, they sicked these 2 massive Mastiff dogs, huge dogs that they had brought with them to chase the natives away. So it's ambiguous, back and forth. Whenever, and that was a cultural difference between the English and the natives on the concept of hospitality. The English had, you come visit and then you leave. The natives had a much broader concept of hospitality. You stayed overnight. You stayed in the wetu of the sachem if you were visiting the sachem. So there were these cultural differences kept coming to light. One day, according to Pring, one day about 70 savages, and they used to call them savages. You'll see that word come up time and time again, the word savage in the 1600s was not as pejorative as it is today. So we have to kind of look at it with a little bit of context. But you see that word come up. But armed with bows and arrows, environed our barricado. The English drove them off with muskets and mastiffs. And then a few days later, the natives set fire to the woods near the fort, and Pring and his men took off. Again, very similar pattern to what we saw. And these are the same Wampanoag tribes that the Mayflower passengers dealt with. It wasn't that much sooner. We're talking the early 1600s, and they communicated. These tribes within and between confederations communicated extensively through runners. They didn't have cell phones, but they did have some pretty, for the time, very sophisticated means of communication. It wasn't just the English. In the early 1600s, the French were looking to establish a colony or a settlement in the Massachusetts area. They were looking very seriously. If things had gone a little differently, I always like to say, if things had gone differently and the French had settled here in 1605 or 1610, Orleans wouldn't be the only town on the Cape with a French name. But there were two voyages in particular that Samuel de Champlain was involved in 1605 and 06. On both voyages, he was second in command. He wasn't in command. He hadn't quite reached the stature that he ultimately did. But he was a recorder and a cartographer. And we're indebted to Champlain for his very detailed writings and maps of the area. The map that you see up there, I don't know if you can make it all out, but you can find this in a number of books. You see a very, very vibrant civilization. This is Nauset Harbor. This is just a few miles from here as the crow flies. You see all the way around the estuary. You see wetus and cornfields and vegetable fields. And he described a very advanced type of civilization and very advanced agricultural practices. The biographer, I think one of the best biographers of Champlain, David Hackett Fisher, talks about the demeanor of the French. They went ashore heavily armed, again the pattern. They took crops without asking, and according to Fisher, they acted as if they owned the place. But on the other hand, there were also very good communications and relations. But it ended in a deadly encounter after a day or so. The crew of his ship were getting water in copper pots. Some natives stole the copper pots. There was a chase. One of the crew members was killed. He was the ship's carpenter. And Demons, who was the commander of the mission, made the decision to leave. So again, hot and cold, but it's a relationship. You think about when Champlain's ship sailed off, or Pring's, or Gosnold's, what the natives must have thought about that visit. It's all there in plain sight. In 1606, Champlain actually returned on another mission with another commander, his name was Portencourt. I'm not good with French at all, but this commander was very aggressive, very insensitive. they landed in what is now Stage Harbor in Chatham. They called it Port Fortune. That's what Champlain named it. They had a problem with a rudder on their ship. Portencourt decided to stay a while. They built an oven to bake bread on the beach and started taking firewood without asking anybody's permission. And Portencourt used to march his musketeers through the Indian settlements, heavily armed. This was, we talk about hot and cold. This one was much more on the cold side. And Portencourt had crosses erected around the area while he was there, which the natives interpreted as a sign of possession. So Portencourt and this Champlain mission was certainly not a positive relationship building mission. It ended in hostilities. There were casualties on both sides. It was just a mess. Again, we're talking about natives who were not far from here when this happened in 1606. Captain Edward Harlow came over on a mission funded by Sir Ferdinando Gorges, who was one of the big funders and promoters of colonization. Among other things, I think you can describe Harlow's journey as somewhat of a kidnapping rampage that went from Maine to Cape Cod and the islands. In the course of this, he took 2 Nausets from Cape Cod. At a subsequent stop, the natives attacked the ship. They came out in canoes with arrows, and sailors were wounded. They were ultimately driven off with their guns. They sailed to Martha's Vineyard, where they captured 2 more natives, one of whom was Epinow. You may have heard of him, but he, like Squanto, is one of the natives who was captured, taken to England, and who made his way back. Epinow came back to Martha's Vineyard. Again, this kidnapping wasn't the first time, certainly not the last time the natives were captured and taken off. They used a tactic. They would lure natives onto the ship just before they were about to leave with the promise of trade. Once they got them on the ship, they subdued them, put them down below, and off to Spain to sell into slavery, or back to England to serve as translators, guides, people that would later help them with colonial efforts. Captain John Smith, Pocahontas fame. We all remember, I think, the Disney version of Pocahontas, very much a legend, but Smith himself is an incredible, absolutely incredible individual that had an incredibly active life, very, very full of himself, very ambitious. I think the best biography of him was aptly titled "A Man Most Driven." But in 1614, he conducted an exploratory voyage of the northeast coast. And his maps and his writings were very influential in future efforts to colonize over here. The map you see is the one, this map was almost certainly on the Mayflower, along with his writings. He was just incredibly influential. He boasted of the New England area. He said that he had seen 4 parts of the world, and if he had a chance to set up a colony, he would do it in New England. And he called Massachusetts the paradise of all those parts. And he also described a very active, large native population that was in the area. And he wrote a book called The Description of New England, which was extremely influential. A little side footnote to history, John Smith almost was on the Mayflower. He almost had Miles Standish's role. He presented himself as a candidate, wanted very much to be on that voyage. He was turned down in favor of Miles Standish. The reasons aren't all that clear, but you can speculate. He was such a pompous, verbose kind of a person. He didn't really fit with the staid Pilgrims, and I think they were a little bit afraid that he might end up being a little bit too dominant. The big byproduct of Smith's mission was, let's see, we're getting on there in time, aren't we? Was Captain Thomas Hunt. When Smith was ready to go back to England, he instructed Hunt, who was a subordinate commander, to stay in America, fill his ship with fish and trade goods, and then come back. Well, Hunt did that, but he also decided to kidnap some natives and take them to Spain to sell them. He did. He took 20 from Pawtuxet, which became Plymouth, and he took 7 from Nauset, right here. One of the ones he took from Pawtuxet was Squanto. When we see the legend, we don't often learn, how did Squanto learn English? The legend doesn't tell us that. Well, Squanto was taken to Spain, some friars intervened and freed him, sent him to England, where he lived for several years with John Slaney, who was a merchant and a promoter of colonization. And he came back to America with Captain Thomas Dermer in 1619. And he learned that his village had been wiped out by the plague. The hazy legend treats Squanto as being kind of the hand of God, that he appeared at just the right time with just the right skills to help the Pilgrims survive the winter. It was really much, much more than that. And we come to the Great Dying, the plague that hit the Native Americans all through New England between 1616 and 1619. Actually, 18 is more accurate. The medical historians differ on what the plague was or who brought it. It doesn't really matter. But the hardest hit was the Massachusetts coast to Plymouth Bay. And Champlain had described the area as being under virtually complete cultivation and habitation in 1605. When the Mayflower came, there was nobody in Pawtuxet. It was completely vacant. They had seen signs that people had been there, but it was the plague. The plague was one of history's great game changers. It really changed the course of history. It was very significant to the balance of power in the area. The Wampanoags were extremely hard hit. Villages, three villages, 2 in addition to Pawtuxet, were wiped out, devastating to the numbers. Massasoit's tribe was reduced to 50 warriors. But west of the Narragansett, the Narragansett tribe was virtually unaffected. So the balance of power changed dramatically. The Wampanoags were weakened, and the balance of power within the Wampanoag Confederation changed. Massasoit's tribe of the Pokanokets were reduced to 50 or 60 warriors. In Aspinet, in Nauset, still had 100. So there was a big shift. Again, the English historians referred to it as the hand of God. Nathaniel Morton wrote that God hath very evidently made way for the English by sweeping away the natives in some great mortalities. It's right, it's in plain sight. That's what he wrote. So into all this comes the Mayflower. Joins the long list. You make a long story short, they sighted land on Cape Cod. They turned south to try to get to their original destination, which was near the Hudson River, where they had a legal land patent to settle. They came back, decided to look around Cape Cod. They had their 3 exploratory missions. A couple things were different about the Mayflower, though. First of all, no canoes rowed out to greet the Mayflower, which happened when other visitors came to America. The natives were present, but with a couple of exceptions, they stayed hidden. The Pilgrims discovered in one of their exploratory missions the remains of the fort that Pring had left, and they stole the corn from Corn Hill. They needed it to survive, so they took it. That became significant a little later. But what might have looked different to the natives? One is there were families. They had never seen this before. There were women and children, intact families. And secondly was the time of the year. These missions almost always came in the late spring or the summer so that they could leave and get back to Europe before the winter hit. During the 3 encounters on the 3rd exploratory mission, we have what we call today the first encounter on the beach by the same name today in Eastham, maybe. We don't know that for sure, but we think it might have been there. On board was a virtual who's who list of Pilgrim leadership. There was Bradford, there was Carver, there was Winslow, there was Standish, Hopkins, and there were also 2 pilots from the crew of the ship, Robert Copen and John Clark. You know, why was this party attacked on the morning of December 8th? The legend doesn't tell us that, but we can figure it out from the history that I just described. It wasn't all that long ago that Hunt had taken had kidnapped the native warriors. There was the theft of corn, which by now they surely would have been aware of. And there were a number of other factors there that we really don't have the time to go into. But after they were attacked, and there were no casualties on either side as best we can tell, it was on to Plymouth. They headed for what Copen had described as Thievish Harbor. It turned out to be Plymouth. They explored Clark's Island. They decided this was the place we were going to settle. They returned to the Mayflower on December 12th. The Mayflower met them in Plymouth, and they found the land had been cleared, but no evidence of any habitation. And remember, Champlain had estimated between 1,000 and 2,000 natives in this area in 1605. We went through the harsh winter of 1621. Only about half of the passengers that had made it to Cape Cod survived the first winter. They were aware of the presence of the natives through a few sightings, campfires and such, but no contact. They were so wary that they buried their dead in the middle of the night with no grave markings so that the observing natives wouldn't see how their numbers were diminishing. And when the alarm sounded, they actually got the sick out of their beds, propped them against trees, and put muskets in their hand to increase the appearance of strength. Massasoit at this time even with his diminished resources, could have easily dispatched this settlement. And there were people that his powwows had encouraged him to do that. Some of his subordinate sachems had encouraged him to do that, but he didn't. And we'll see why in a second. So you've got this miserable winter. It's starting to get warmer on a particularly warm day in March. A native walks into their village. He's a big guy, very imposing looking, shocks the heck out of the pilgrims who were all in the street going about their business. And what shocked them the most was that when he got into the village, he greets them. He says, "Welcome, Englishmen." The native, his name was Samoset. He was a sachem from Maine. History is very unclear as to what he was doing in Patuxet at the time. Nobody really knows why. But it's pretty apparent that Massasoit had sent him in as kind of an advanced scout. He spent that afternoon speaking with the Pilgrim leadership. He told them about the land was called Patuxet. He told them about the plague. He told them about the land. He told them about the strength of the native tribes in the area. He said that Massasoit's tribe was the closest, and they were about 60 strong, and that the Nausets on Cape Cod were about 100. And these numbers turned out to be very accurate. He wasn't gaslighting the pilgrims. He was giving them accurate information. But the most important thing I think that Samoset told them is he told them about Hunt and why the Nausets were so ticked off. And in Winslow's recounting, he said, "They are very much incensed and provoked by the English by reason of one Hunt, a master of a ship who deceived the people under the color of trucking with them, 20 out of here and 7 out of Nauset, and carried them away and sold them for slaves." So this was the first time that the pilgrims heard about Hunt and the kidnappings. Remember, there was no cell phone, there were no cell phones, there was no cable news. They wouldn't have known that. But Samoset told them that Massasoit wanted to meet with him, that he was nearby, and that he would be back. And 4 days later, Samoset returned with 4 other Indians, one of whom was Squanto, who spoke much better English than Samoset did. And Samoset advised them that Massasoit was nearby with his brother, and they wanted to meet. And Samoset appeared on the hill, and the pilgrims sent Edward Winslow up the hill to negotiate the terms of a meeting, which he did. And the result was the Great Peace Agreement of 1621. These are the 6 points. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here other than to say that number 4 is the key. If any did unjustly war against him, we would aid him, and if any did war against us, he should aid us. It was a mutual assistance pact, is what it turned out to be. It was a diplomatic effort on both parties. The other 5 items, several are very one-sided looking. It looks like the treaty as a whole favored the English, but this is the English version of it. This is what Winslow wrote to send back to England. We don't know how the natives interpreted it. There's evidence later on that they did interpret it differently, but there was no common language. It was all done through interpreters. After all this history and all the kidnappings and all the advice that Massasoit was getting from his powwows and from the other sachems, why did he agree to peace? Well, the reason was that this was an early example of the diplomacy of mutual self-interest. The myth marginalizes the reasons. They claim this was just part of the benevolent, predestined way things went, but the reality was that both sides had specific interests. Massasoit was weakened greatly by the plague. The Narragansetts were threatening, they were very strong, and he needed an ally. Even though the Pilgrims didn't have big numbers, he was impressed with their technology, and he needed somebody that he could count on. Carver and the Pilgrims were small and weak. They needed help to survive. They needed trading partners, and they needed allies. So both sides were small in population. Land was seemingly unlimited. And some of the disparate views on cultural issues just didn't come into play yet. So the two groups of people who up to now had interacted under a cloud of mutual suspicion now formed a strategic alliance. And this is basically what saved Plymouth Colony and ultimately gave rise to the history that followed. While there were some bumps in the road, this treaty basically held until King Philip's War at the end of near the end of the century, 1675, and on Cape Cod for longer than that, because King Philip's War basically didn't affect Cape Cod. There were peaceful relationships here. A significant event after that was the Mayflower headed home. The Mayflower stayed because Jones's crew, Master Jones's crew, was hit as hard as the settlers were with the illnesses and the harsh winter. He really wasn't able to get out of here until April 5th, when they weighed anchor to leave. Interestingly enough, not a single Pilgrim took the opportunity to give up and go home. On the other hand, one member of the crew decided to stay, and that was John Alden, who later became one of the leaders of the colony, and he was the last of the Mayflower passengers to die. In July of 1621, Bradford had sent Edward Winslow and Stephen Hopkins to visit Massasoit to cement the treaty, which they did. And one of the things they discussed in their meeting was how the Pilgrims could repay the corn debt and settle things up with the Nausetts. They were concerned about that. They said at the beginning that they wanted to settle that debt. They discussed it with Massasoit, and apparently he did help them from the reaction of the sachems that they met when they did ultimately settle the debt. And they also discussed improving trade between the two peoples. So it was an ongoing process, and one of the events that tested the commitment of both parties to the peace alliance was the recovery of the Billington boy. Young kid wandered into a native village. He was sent to Nauset. The Pilgrims sent a rescue party of 10 to recover the boy. They encountered, on the way they stopped at Cummaquid, which is now Barnstable. Ino, the sachem there, agreed to help them, but the most important thing about their stop to Cummaquid is that they encountered an old woman who they estimated as being 103. And Winslow, I won't quote the whole thing, but he wrote a very poignant piece about the encounter, how she told them that she had lost 3 sons to hunt, kidnapped her sons, and now she was deprived of her sons during her old age. So they were reminded that for a second time in a few months that hunt had caused some major problems. They assured the woman and the Comaquid tribe that they were not, they would not do something like that, that they considered Hunt to be a bad man, as Winslow said. Comaquid accompanied the party to Aspinet, who was in Nauset. They saw the 100 warriors that he had available to them, but Aspinet agreed to peace on the same terms as they had with Massasoit. And he returned the boy, and the arrangements were made at that time to settle the corn debt. So that was one thing checked off the list. They had promised to settle that debt, and they did at that time. So this was a significant event. It occurred right here. There's a number of events that are going to happen later in the summer to commemorate the Billington recovery. In July of 1623, Massasoit fell deadly ill. Again, Winslow was sent. It was the custom that when a sachem was dying, neighboring tribes sent representatives to say goodbye to the dying sachem. The Pilgrims decided to become a part of that. Winslow and a visitor, John Hamden, went. And interestingly enough, Winslow was able to give Massasoit some potence. He seemed to recognize what Massasoit's problem was, and he was cured. Whether that was a direct result of what Winslow did or not is lost to history, but everybody at the time thought that he did. And this was a great boon to the reputation of the Pilgrims in the tribe. And then finally, just one final piece of evidence that the treaty was working was the wreck of the Sparrowhawk. The Sparrowhawk, which almost certainly wasn't actually called the Sparrowhawk, but that's another story, wrecked again within a few miles of where we're sitting here on the other direction in Orleans off Pleasant Bay. It was a ship full of Irish two English entrepreneurs and some Irish indentured servants who were intent on starting a plantation, a tobacco plantation in Virginia. They, like the Mayflower, got off course and wrecked. While they were coming ashore, they were approached by a large group of natives. They didn't know what was happening. They thought this was going to be a violent encounter. They readied their muskets, and one of the natives shouted out, "Are you Bradford's men?" They realized that they weren't in danger. And the natives, we have such a great life-saving heritage here in Orleans. It's significant that our first responders in a life-saving shipwreck situation were Native Americans. A great tradition started there, but this shows the natives helped get word to Bradford. Bradford sent a rescue crew, and the Nauset tribe was very helpful through the whole process of saving and rescuing these shipwrecked people. So it was a historical clue that the work that had been done in 1621 and 1622 was at least working, and there were peaceful relations during those years. This brings us to the end, and boy, I'm over time here, but as usual, the paradigm change. This is a good point to stop, because the paradigm changed greatly in 1630 when the Puritan fleet, the Winthrop fleet, and the Arabella came over. All of the factors, the land to people ratio changed, livestock started to be shipped over, and the paradigm changed dramatically. So That's a subject of another lecture. What happened between 1630 and 1625 is another story altogether, completely different, because the goodwill and the peaceful relationship that did exist did start to fall apart quickly after that. And all of the issues about cultural extinction and the issues around the missionaries and what they were accomplishing, Eliot and Samuel Treat and the others all come into play. But, at that point, knowing I'm way over, I'm going to stop and just see if there's any quick questions or comments by anybody.
The sparrowhawk, but it's got rooster and harwich, but in 16, whatever, 25, it's not harwich and rooster, isn't it all harwich?
Well, no, back in, there was nothing,
Those towns aren't even named.
They're not. No, you're absolutely right. And that map,
It was just the slide before, I think.
yeah, that map was made in 16, what am I doing here?
Just before that. There it is.
That map was made in about 1865. What happened was, and we didn't go into any of this, but the shell, the remains of the sparrowhawk surfaced because of the shifting tides. And this map was actually drawn in 1865 or thereabouts. Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that was a map of 16.
I just looked up.
Your photo of the Billington boy, was that one of those romanticized pictures from much, much later? Because it's shown as a little boy on someone's shoulders.
Yes.
My understanding that John Billington Jr. was actually much, much older and wasn't necessarily lost as much as he went missing.
There's two things. Number one, the picture is a later picture, and it does, when you look at it, you would tend to think that you're dealing with somebody younger. Billington, most historians agree that Billington was 16-ish, give or take a year, and that seems to be a smaller boy than that, although people weren't as big then. Kids weren't as big then. So I don't know, but that is a later picture, and it wasn't somebody drawing the actual scene. But the other part of the question was
He actually didn't leave Plymouth and got lost, that he actually went missing, that he didn't like being indentured and he wanted out.
well, he wasn't indentured. He was part of a weird family that was the Billingtons were they were maverick people. Billington's father ended up being the first pilgrim executed in Plymouth Colony for murder. His son, his other younger brother, Francis Billington, fired off a shotgun as the Mayflower was entering Plymouth Harbor, and very near where the gunpowder was being stored for the ship. That could have ended the whole mission right there. But there is a theory, and it's just that Billington didn't get lost, that he intentionally was running away to get away from his family. There's no historical evidence for that. It's certainly a plausible possibility given all the circumstances. Bradford describes it as a kid that got lost. We'll never know the truth, but that theory that you describe has been proposed, that he didn't get lost, that he intentionally ran away. William Martin, the novelist, when he writes the story, he writes it as if Billington ran away, but he cites no historical evidence, and to the best of my knowledge, there is none. And it's possible, but I don't think we'll ever know.
What is that Il Nasib on the east side of the cape?
I don't know what that means.
Just sandbar, except Il, I think is French for island.
Yeah, I think because the islands are inside, at least today. I'm not sure what the topography of the land, that would have been 1863. I know the inlets are in different places on this map than they are today, but that happens. Just like on Champlain's map, the inlet is in a different place. But I wish I could help you with that, but I don't know.
One quick question. So the Mayflower, I know during the away missions, they found a body in one of the graves that had very fair hair. Do you think it could have been from that prayer post?
It could have been. It could have been from Pring. That's another part of the story that's received a lot of speculation. And there are missions that there are exploratory missions and trade missions and fishermen who came to all of the whole coast of New England that are just unrecorded, that we don't know. There's some speculation that was an honored individual who was assimilating into the tribe, and might have been the father of the young person that was also in the grave. But that story's one that's been speculated on for some time, and I don't know that we'll ever know the real answer to that. Any other questions? Well, I apologize for holding up a little beyond what we'd agreed to, and thank you very much.
Ron, thank you very much. It was very enlightening. I think for those of us here this evening, it provided me a much deeper understanding of when perspective becomes reality. And so we have multiple perspectives, we have multiple myths, we have real history, we have real data. For those of you interested in timelines, look around the gallery up here. You will see some Orleans dates that are really important in conjunction with this evening's lecture. None of those are up there. The earliest one we start with is 1626 with the Sparrowhawk. But these are a lot of important dates. We have another lecture series, an ongoing story around the 1600s. It would be the Hopkins family. It is July 8th, and it's being presented by Jay and Ann Stradell. And we look forward to seeing you. I'm going to be offering you an opportunity to get some questions answered about the material culture that's off in the corner, and that's July 22nd. So please do come. Invite your friends to come. We can seat 80 in here. Please bring more people. Thank you. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Bill.
We hope you've enjoyed this program. There are a number of ways you can continue to help us provide more programming and more experiences for the community. Here are several ways to do that. You can donate, you can get involved, you can volunteer, but we look forward to your support. Thank you very much, and see you soon.